Okay, so welcome to what is hopefully our last online lecture for this class. We are covering the Thompson paper and the Rachel's paper. We're going to finish up the Rachel's and look at some of the further objections. There are some things in Thompson that I want to try to cover as well, but we'll see. So the last class dealt with this, I think, really interesting claim about moral methodology in a certain way. So if you recall, there was this suggestion that we can find out whether or not the distinction between active and passive makes a difference by looking at two cases that we think are identical in all respects except for the fact that one is passive and one is active, right? So in one case, no one is doing anything. They are simply allowing something to occur. And in the other case, someone is doing something, right? And remember, these were both cases where the outcome was bad. And in one case, someone did it. The child was murdered, right? So these were the two cases with the uncle who wants the child to be dead for financial reasons. In the one case, he actually murders the child. In the other case, he doesn't, because the child is drowning when he arrives, and he's ready to kill the child if the child miraculously survives. So we have these two cases, and we're supposed to feel that because in that case we don't really think there's a difference, that there's never going to be a difference. And so there are several questions we might have about the way this argument works, because it's interesting. And it can allow us to think about this methodology, because this is a common methodology in philosophy, in ethics. If you look at, especially a lot of contemporary ethics, Derek Parfit is someone who does this all the time. And this is sort of his way of doing philosophy in large part. You're supposed to have intuitions about different cases. Now, it can be done well, and there can be cases where I think your intuitions are strong enough that this can be a great way to do philosophy. But there are also things we need to be perhaps wary of. The first of the things that we need to be wary of is, as I said last time, that we're dealing with a fairly extreme case. And it might be that when you get beyond a certain point, perhaps the system is just overloaded. And it's really hard to make out differences because we've already classified that action in such an extreme way. And we've been able to put that person who performed that action into a special category of bad actors where we've just written them off. So, first of all, it might be that the way that we normally feel about these things is not going to be terribly sensitive when we get to such an extreme. It's the same when you get to the limits of your hearing or your sight, right? When things get so loud, it's difficult to hear them. So perhaps, therefore, when we're faced with a difference in the moral status that we assign to two cases, perhaps even if that difference is significant, if it's less obvious than the overwhelming influence that is so strong in the other direction, both of these are bad actions, and they are more similar to each other than they are to the action of someone eating an ice cream, say, perhaps we can't trust our intuitions in this case because we've got such an extreme response in one direction, and we can't really be sensitive to this relatively minor distinction within that extreme. And this is the point that is indicated by the quote I have there from Richard Trammell. The fact that one cannot distinguish the taste of two wines when both are mixed with green persimmon juice doesn't imply that there's no distinction between the wines. All right, so here we have a physical example of this kind of phenomenon that we might be worried about here. So you have an overwhelming taste of green persimmon juice. I've never had that, but it's probably very strong. And you've mixed both wines with this, and now that you've mixed them, you can't taste any difference. You can just taste the green persimmon juice. That is like the overall badness of these two actions. It's so strong that how are you going to tell the differences between the two wines? But that doesn't mean they're not different. And especially, it doesn't mean that they're not going to be different and show up as such in other cases that are perhaps less extreme. And on these lines, we get the great counterexamples that are in the foot paper. And these are Rescue 1 and Rescue 2. So Rescue 1 is a case that goes as follows. A rescue team is hurrying in a jeep to save 5 people threatened by the ocean tide. On the way, they see a single drowning person whom they could stop and save, only at the cost of failing to rescue the 5. So here they're behaving in a way that allows one person to die. They see the drowning person. They could stop and save this person. But if they do, they're not going to make it and save the 5. So in this case, the rescue team is going to the 5. They've got a call, go to these 5 people. They see someone else drowning, say it's a storm. They pass this person to get to the 5. Rescue 2, a rescue team is hurrying in a jeep to save 5 people threatened by the ocean tide. On the way, they encounter a single trapped person blocking the road and realize that they can save the 5 only by driving over him. Now, in Rescue 2, we've got an action that seems clearly impermissible, or at least more impermissible than we have in Rescue 1. Rescue 1, we might think, is permissible, or perhaps we might even think obligatory. Like if we are a rescue team, as it says, we might think that in virtue of our position, we have a particular obligation to save the greater number. Maybe if an ordinary person did this, it might be that we think somewhat less of their action. Maybe not, though. I mean, if you really know that there are 5 people, let's say that you can see both groups. You could go to the 1 or you could go to the 5, and you're going to the 5. That seems to be obligatory. You could panic and not know what to do, but that wouldn't be the right decision. You wouldn't be blamed for it, per se, if it was really an overload. But in Rescue 2, you're clearly doing something that has a more controversial moral status, and most of us would think is just wrong, right? You are on the way, you have to kill this person to get to the 5. That seems wrong. Now, in both cases, we have identical consequences, right? We have one person dying and 5 people living. One of these is okay, and most people, I think, have this intuition that the rescue team is morally permitted to drive by the single drowning person, but not permitted to drive by the single trapped person in Rescue 2. So this is a case where we're looking at a different thought experiment, and arguably in this case, the only difference is the difference between activity and passivity. And here we have strong intuitions about this. Now, this shouldn't really be a big surprise to us because we really get our principles to some extent from intuitions about individual cases. So it would be strange if we had this intuition that the difference between doing and allowing mattered, and we just hadn't really thought of any cases before, right? So Rachel's can choose a case and do what he does, but other people can choose other cases. And, from the perspective of what the methodology is, it doesn't seem that there's much Rachel's can say to stop other people from doing the same thing and saying, look, in this case, it is different. So the difference matters. So that's the first kind of objection. We can come up, as Foote does, with a good experiment that seems to show the opposite thing. Another comment on this, and I'm not assigning these further papers only because there's only 1 or 2 points I want to take out of them. Another thing to say comes from a philosopher, Warren Quinn, who didn't write a ton of things but wrote good things in general, is that there might be an intrinsic difference between killing and letting die. So these two things are different, morally speaking, even though it's not true that every case of killing is morally worse than every case of letting die. Right? So what we're doing here is questioning the structure of the thought experiment procedure itself. And Quinn was thinking that if we can come up with this case, and in that case we reach the verdict that one is the same as the other in this instance, they're equally bad, that means that the two are completely the same. But this is, I think, a fairly rudimentary way of assuming that moral differences are going to show up. Okay? So there can be differences between two things even though they don't produce different results in every situation. This is just true of physical things. Maybe two chemicals will react a certain way that's very different when they're put in water, but in most cases, nothing happens. There's no obvious difference between the two that shows up, right? This can happen, and with the idea that there's an intrinsic moral difference, we shouldn't be, first of all, so sure that we'd be sensitive to it. That's the first point about the persimmon juice in the wine. There's also a questioning here, which is essentially to the effect of, well, just because we get some cases where one thing actually is worse than another, that doesn't mean that there's no difference. Because it's a simplistic assumption, and I think this is right, to think that if there's a difference, it always has to be exactly the same. Make exactly the same, produce exactly the same difference that's manifest to us in each case. So Quinn argues instead, so he doesn't just point this out, that there's no real reason to think that any alleged real difference is going to show up in an apparent difference every time. He argues also, though, that any intuitive difference between killing and letting die that we are aware of isn't best expressed in a general judgment that one is worse than the other. So there is a difference between them, but it's that one of them involves a violation of positive rights and the other involves a violation of negative rights. And in the fact that one of these two types of rights is more difficult to override than the other. So this is getting back to what we started out with when we talked about rights. And the suggestion here is that it doesn't need to be the case for us to say that the moral status of doing one thing is different than the moral status of doing another, it doesn't need to be the case that that's always going to show up in the claim that one of the two actions is worse. It might be that there is a difference that is there in all cases, but only becomes apparent in certain cases. And that difference has to do with the type of rights that we're violating if we engage in a certain behavior. So in the bathtub case, if we don't save the child, we are violating the child's positive rights. And those, you could think, are positive rights that in fact we feel are very stringent. Because although we don't think that we have obligations towards adults when it comes to saving them, in many cases, we're more inclined, it's not true that we don't think that, but I feel like we're more inclined to think that we have to save a child. And so if there is a positive right to being provided with life-saving help, children have that more than others. If we violate the child's negative right by killing it, that is also very bad. But this is a case, we might think, where the positive right actually is much stronger than a positive right often is. So the idea here is that there are these two types of rights, and one of them is in general, that would be the negative rights, more difficult to override. There might be cases where the stakes are high enough that you can override certain positive or negative rights. So just to take a non-controversial example, let's say that you need to basically steal someone's car to prevent a tragedy. There is a tragedy that you can help stop if only you can get to a certain place at a certain time. If you steal a car, you have a really good chance of making that huge tragedy not happen. That seems like you'd be justified. If someone is attacking you and you need to, steal something from someone to use as a weapon, that also seems like it's okay. So the basic point here is just that the fact that in this case the two examples might be equally wrong doesn't tell us that there's no difference. Quinn says, this objection seems to presuppose that if letting someone die is ever more acceptable, ceteris paribus, other things being equal, than killing someone, it must be because some intrinsic moral disvalue attaches to killing, but not to letting die. So ceteris paribus means other things being equal. Okay, so basically what this means is that we're to imagine that the two cases described are ceteris paribus. All other things except the thing we are looking at are identical. So we have a case of letting die and a case of killing. This is what Rachel's just trying to give us. If we ever find that letting die is more acceptable, it has to be because there's an intrinsic moral disvalue that's attached to killing but not to letting die. And if so, this intrinsic moral difference, intrinsic difference should show up in all such cases. But the doctrine may, and I shall argue should, be understood in a quite different way. The basic thing is not that killing is intrinsically worse than letting die, or more generally that harming is worse than failing to save from harm. But these different choices run up against different kinds of rights, one of which is stronger than the other in the sense that it is less easily defeated. But its greater strength in this sense does not entail that its violation need be noticeably worse. So one way to explain what is going on in Rachel's example along these lines is to say the following. So we can say that positive rights can be more easily overridden than negative rights to non-interference. So the first question you want to ask is, how easily is this right overridden? How strong do the circumstances need to be for this particular right to be one that can be violated? That's the first question. Okay, and then we determine whether the right can be violated or not. Now, in cases where neither right has been overridden, when both rights are there, what Quinn is saying here is that that's going to be equally bad. So there aren't distinctions between the badness associated with violating a right, but there are distinctions between how easy it is to violate a right. Okay, so to understand the distinction here, what's being said is that this is a case with these two wicked uncles where there are rights that are standing. In neither case have the relevant rights been overridden by anything. So, as a human being, if you can save another human being, you have a positive duty to do that. And so other people have a claim against you to your aid. If your aid is going to save their life, and the cost of your aid to you is very small, negligible, or even quite small, even rather large, right? I don't know where the threshold is. You should save that person. You're morally obligated. So there are duties of beneficence. And in this case, there's that one, that you have an obligation to save another individual. So the individual has a claim against you that you help them. There are also additional duties that come from the fact, perhaps, that this is a child and an adult. Perhaps we think that we have more of an obligation. Maybe we don't, right? Maybe we can, on reflection, think, no, actually we don't, right? This is a strong feeling. There are also, arguably, special duties of care that the uncle has as a family member or a potential caregiver for this child, right? That could be coming in and affecting our intuitions too. So there is, in the case described where the uncle does not do anything, a right is violated there. In the case where the uncle actually does something and kills, a right is violated there too. It is easier to override the right to benefit. So we could imagine other cases where that right to benefit is overridden. That would be happening in something like the rescue cases that Foote lays out, right? We could say that you have an obligation to rescue the one person, but that can be overridden if bypassing them will allow you a very good chance of saving 5. Maybe if the chance of saving the 5 is particularly low, the right thing to do is just to stay with the 1. But there are cases where this can be overridden. This can also be overridden, if you think about it, when it comes to cases where you have a personal attachment to one of the individuals involved. It's not just, I think, that it's intelligible that someone might choose to save their own child as opposed to letting 3 children that they don't know at all die, right? I think we also just think it's not necessarily wrong. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe we think it's wrong and people just can never be expected to do that, but I think we just don't say it's wrong. And so in that case, you can favor the fact that one of the individuals is your child, and that can override your obligation to save the greater number. Okay? So these are cases where overriding happens, and it looks like it does. When it comes to the right not to be killed, it's far more difficult to override that, right? And the fact that I can save my own 3 kids if I kill this other child, that's not going to fly, right? That's wrong. I can't push some other human being in danger's way to stop something that otherwise would hurt my own children. I can choose to save, perhaps, my own one child rather than 3 others. I'm not sure, right? But this is clearly different. So the idea here is that there are differences in how easy it is to override a right, but once a right has been overridden, you've done a very bad thing. And it's equally bad. To illustrate this, using another case, Quinn uses an analogy, another similar case, of your right to privacy. So you have a right to privacy, but this right to privacy that you have can be defeasible in certain instances. There are cases where it's overridden. And in particular, it's easier for the police to override your right to privacy than it is for ordinary people. So the police have certain ways in which their overriding someone's right to privacy is considered to be not a violation of rights. If the police suspect that you are endangering someone else behind a locked door, you don't have the right to continue doing that. If they have good evidence to suggest this, then your right is waived, your right to privacy. The police have more of an ability to be able to override your right to privacy. You have a right to free movement. The police also have more of a... There are more cases where the police can restrict your free movement, and we think that's okay. So they have an easier time overriding than ordinary citizens. It's harder for an ordinary citizen to justify going in to someone's email, even on the same suspicion, perhaps. But this doesn't mean that if your right to privacy is not overridden in any given case, it's going to be better for the police to violate it. In fact, it's generally worse for the police to violate this if it's not overridden, because Quinn says moral blame for the violation of a right depends very much more on motive and expected harm than on the degree to which the right is defeasible. So Quinn really is trying to argue that there's room for a great deal of complexity here. And there are questions over and above which of these is worse. The more structured, nuanced view of what's going on is that there are these 2 types of rights, and one of them can be overridden in certain ways. And here we're getting, with this reference to the police, this idea that there might be a different standard in this case for how easy is it for this individual to override the right in the right sort of case, and the separate question of how bad is it when the right is still there and you violate it. Those are separate. So that's the suggestion that Quinn is making, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I want to turn now to look at another paper on this same topic that also has some good points to make. Okay. This is an interesting paper because it deals in general with the methodology of this kind of thought experiment. And since we started talking about this, and this has kind of been my focus this time, I thought it would help to mention this. So Shelley Kagan has a paper called the Additive Fallacy. Essentially, the argument here is an instance of a particular type of reasoning called a contrast argument. So this is supposed to criticize the broader methodology of doing this in philosophy. That's one of the great things about philosophy is, just weigh in on the questions. You can also criticize an entire way of asking and answering the questions. So these contrast arguments that Kagan thinks are suspect are cases where we try to establish the general significance or insignificance of some particular factor by contrasting cases where that factor is either there or not there, right? So this is exactly the methodology that Rachels wants us to use. And it's assumed when we're doing this in the contrast argument that if the presence or absence of a factor makes a moral difference in the case at issue, the factor is going to be generally significant. If it doesn't make a moral difference, the factor is generally insignificant. So this is similar to the position that we saw in Quinn. It's slightly different, though, because there's less of an explanation as to why this is happening in this particular case. Quinn gives us this whole story about types of rights and overriding versus how bad it is to violate. So Kagan says, a very common form of argument proceeds by offering a pair of cases that differ only in terms of the factor in question. If we judge the two cases to be morally different, it is argued the difference must arise from the different values of the given factor, and so the factor is shown to be morally relevant. If we judge the cases to be similar, on the other hand, despite the variation in the given factor, this shows that the factor is not actually morally relevant after all. Let us call the pair of cases offered for comparison-contrast cases, let us call arguments of this sort contrast arguments. So now we have a description of the kind of methodology that was employed by Rachels. And Kagan is going to call this a contrast argument. And he wants to look at the general assumptions that are being made for Rachels to use this kind of argument in the way that he wants to. And the general assumption that's being made is referred to as ubiquity. It tells us that if variation in a given factor makes a difference in any case, it was going to make a difference in every case. Okay, so we need this ubiquity to be true for us to engage in the kind of reasoning, the argument that we get from Rachels. Because Rachels is giving us this case and saying that this factor makes no difference in this case. If that isn't true, we can't infer anything about euthanasia from the wicked uncle case. So imagine that ubiquity is false. If that's the case, the difference between killing and letting die might be irrelevant in one case because this is possible now. The wicked uncle case, perhaps this difference is irrelevant, but it can still be relevant in other cases, including that of euthanasia. But is the ubiquity thesis true? Kagan says no. Okay. Now, the big difference between the Kagan point and the Quinn point that we just saw is that one of them is providing a particular kind of explanation, and Kagan is not. This also makes Kagan's point a bit more general, but less specified. So Kagan thinks that this ubiquity thesis is false, that if a factor can make a difference in one case, it has to make a difference in every case. Kagan thinks that we sometimes think that this is plausible, this ubiquity thesis. So if there's any difference between killing and letting die, it has to be that that difference shows up in every case. Kagan thinks that we can make this mistake because we misunderstand the idea that morality involves universal principles. So it seems to be true, if we think about it, that when we speak about what is morally right, we intend to speak about what is universally morally right. And that doesn't mean that that doesn't differ by situation, right? So you can say, for example, that in this case, it's okay for someone to steal because otherwise they would starve. But in this case, it isn't okay for them to steal because they just want to have an extra Corvette or something, right? We can admit those differences and we're not moral relativists because we haven't said anything about there not being universal moral truths. There is a universal moral truth to the effect that in this case, stealing might be okay, and in this case, it certainly isn't. So we have this idea that when we make moral claims, they're supposed to be universal. And any exceptions there are to what we're saying, those are also captured by universal rules. And Kagan thinks that going with this idea, we tend to take a simplistic view sometimes and think that that means that if the same factor is in both cases have to have the same status. Kagan thinks no, universality is true, but that expression of it is too simple. So what is true about moral reasoning when we say that it's universal? What is universal about it is the following. There is some function, some set of rules that enables us to infer the moral status of an action from a set of relevant factors. Okay? And it has to be the case that that rule applies in every situation. And also that if two actions are completely identical to each other, then they have to be morally identical. They both have to be right or wrong and to the same extent. Right? So there is a universality. There's always one rule that we think applies. And the relevant factors can differ, but the rule does not. And if sometimes that rule, when we apply it to the situations, if that sometimes produces a case where two situations look identical, that doesn't mean that it's going to be that way in all cases. Because it might be that the same rule means that the two cases are different when the relevant factors are different. We just need to have a rule that tells us what to say in every case. That's why we're calling it a function. A function is, like in math, like the 2 plus 2, the function is addition. And so 2 plus 2 is defined by giving the answer 4. The plus is defined in that way. So we have this way of determinately getting moral status from descriptions. That doesn't mean that when the function is applied universally to all cases, it has to be true that the way it is applied is always additive. And that if a factor makes one contribution in one context, it has to make the same in all contexts. Okay? So what Kagan is going on to suggest here is that there can be differences between relevant circumstances where the differences aren't just a matter of how much of a difference does this factor make. That's what is meant by the additive idea. So it's always going to be a plus value or a minus value. If it is that way in one case. So if a factor makes a plus contribution in one case, then it always has to do that, maybe to a lesser extent, and so on. So The view which underlies the use of contrast arguments seems to be this. The function that determines the overall status of the act given the values of the particular factors is an additive one. That is, the status of the act is the net balance or sum, which is the result of adding up the separate positive and negative effects of the individual factors. On this view, each factor makes a contribution, whether positive or negative, to the moral status of the act. The strength of the contribution will depend on the particular value of the factor in the given situation. Example, how much good will be done by the act. The overall status is the sum of these positive and negative contributions. Now, this is a view that Kagan rejects as too simple. So we have a picture here where we're looking at actions, and there are a number of factors that happen in different cases, and we can assign a definite plus or minus value to any particular factor that can happen across situations. So if this is a case of doing versus allowing, that's +3 versus +2 or something like that. There's always a value. And we're just adding up all the different values which remain constant. And the contribution that a given factor always makes is in terms of that one value being added. Kagan thinks that's wrong. There are going to be cases where the function that you're applying is going to tell you that, in fact, in that case, the difference in question has no significance or has the opposite significance. Right? So this is the suggestion here. And to make sense of this case so that we have some further grasp on what's being said, Kagan discusses these two mathematical examples. So we have here S being a sum equals x plus y plus z. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about an additive function. If you look at this function with x plus y plus z, the contribution of y to the overall sum can be determined independently of the values of the other factors. So we don't need to know what any of the other things are for us to know what the presence of y is going to do. No matter what, if y is there, it's going to add 5 if y equals 5. We don't need to determine all three to know what y is going to do. Whatever happens, y is going to add whatever number y happens to be. With the multiplicative function, the multiplication one, we have s equals x times y plus z. Now here, the value that y contributes is going to depend on the value of x. If x is 0 in this function, y is not going to make any contribution regardless of what its value is. So y could be as high or as low as we want, right? If x is 0, then we're going to end up with 0 plus z. So here z has the same function as it would in addition. And what it's doing can be determined independently of what the other things are doing. But that is not true of y. And this is just meant to show what can be happening in the case of moral comparisons. There can be some cases where the sum total of factors actually serves to mean that one of the factors doesn't count at all. There can be other cases where the sum total of factors allows that factor to count. So we have this different approach to questioning the way that Rachels conducts the thought experiment. Now, so far, without an example of this going on that Kagan can provide, we've just got this abstract possibility that it might be like this mathematical case. So Kagan does give us cases that show that we reject the additive assumption. So if we look at our particular intuitions about specific cases, Kagan thinks that in fact most of us, if we look at these, are going to find that we reject the additive assumption in this case. And so across the board, there can be other cases where it doesn't hold. So, self-defense 1. In order to defend myself against the aggressor, I push him into a pit, expecting the fall to kill him. Self-defense 2. In order to defend myself against the aggressor, I refrain from warning him about the pit into which he is about to fall, and I expect the fall to kill him. So here we have a case where you have a right to self-defense. You are, in one case, pushing the person who's attacking you into the pit. In the other case, you're just not helping the person. Now, what Kagan wants to say is here the idea that you're defending yourself kind of functions like the zero in the other example. So once you've got the self-defense thing, the other differences effectively don't count. Okay? So the difference is irrelevant in these cases. It isn't just that it's outweighed, but that in this particular case, because self-defense is involved, it's irrelevant. Right? So this is what, in concrete terms of a moral comparison, the multiplication type example looks like. You've got one factor that, in fact, doesn't just mean that these other factors are going to be outweighed. It means that they don't have any value. They don't make a difference. Once it's self-defense, the rest doesn't matter. So Kagan says, most of us will certainly want to claim that the moral status of these two cases is the same. So you're no worse if you push than if you let the person fall, because this person is attacking you. Even though, obviously enough, in the first case I do harm, well, in the second case I merely allow it. Not everyone will accept this judgment. Some may insist there is a slight difference, but it is lost on our insufficiently sensitive intuitions. Others, example pacifists, may claim that the difference is rather significant. Nonetheless, most of us will want to maintain that the distinction between doing and allowing harm makes no difference in such legitimate cases of self-defense. The crucial point to see is that even if the advocate of the do-allow distinction wants to make this claim, it's coherent for them to do so. In fact, this view that although the difference between doing and allowing harm typically has a great effect on the moral status of an act, in cases of self-defense, it makes no difference whatsoever. Most of us want to claim that that is true. So most of us, when we hear this case, hold both that the difference between doing and allowing harm does matter to the moral status of the case. But in this case, where self-defense is going on, it's irrelevant. So this is something that we're supposed to see when we look at this other case. And I think that Kagan has a really strong point here, because I do find myself thinking, well, yeah, in general, it's going to be worse to push than to let someone fall. Especially, say, if you are out in public and it happens rather quickly that someone falls. Maybe you could have saved, but you don't. It still seems worse to me, especially if it's an adult, and depending on the situation and the ease, it's certainly going to be worse in most cases to push. So we want to say that there's generally this distinction when we think about that case, but in this case, we don't think there is such a distinction. And I think most of us would say, well, it's self-defense in any case. Right? And so this is the idea here. And this is just supposed to show that the additive assumption is implausible. Once it is, the kind of moral reasoning that is engaged in by Rachel's is going to be more suspect. It's not going to be impossible to do it, but we do need to be aware that we have to be careful to make sure that the cases we're looking at are similar enough, that they don't involve these major differences that neutralize values. And that's going to be harder. Now, I think that the cases that Rachel's looks at, one thing we can ask ourselves about them is how similar are those to the actual situation. Now, we have, of course, the wicked uncle cases, but that's not the only argument that Rachel's has. Rachel's also has describing these cases to us and having us say something. So our responses to those cases might be important. And it might be that when we're comparing the cases, we can trust our intuitions, even if in other cases, we don't suppose that the difference between doing and allowing is going to have an invariant effect. Right? So we can reject the universal strategy that employs the wicked uncle cases that arguably depends on this additive fallacy, but still take the specific cases that he shows us in a particular way. That's one way that this argument could affect us, even not talking about the wicked uncle part. And so we might end up agreeing with Rachel's that the distinction is not important in those cases. But that isn't going to necessarily mean that we think it's never important. Right? That's the point here. So maybe in the specific case, or the specific cases under discussion, euthanasia is the same as letting die. But there can be other cases where it isn't, and where one is worse. That's the suggestion here. So just to make clear, again, I don't think I need to do this. So I'm just saying that you're plugging in different numbers and you're getting the result that sometimes a factor doesn't have the same contribution to the sum total because of the other factors. Another kind of case that's supposed to show this, to further illustrate, assume that we assign a negative value to states of affairs involving human suffering, and that other things being equal, we think that we should perform the action that relieves the most suffering. Thus, if Mike and Brian are both suffering, but Mike's suffering is much worse, we think that there is more reason to help Mike. Okay? So we think in general, in many cases, there's negative values that we can assign to different states of human suffering. And other things being equal, there's that ceteris paribus phrase again. So everything except this factor being held the same. We think that we ought to perform the action that relieves the most suffering. So if there are no further differences between our two actions, we should do the one that relieves the most suffering. So an application of this, if Mike and Brian are both suffering, but Mike's suffering is much worse, he's in more pain, we think that we have more reason to help Mike. In the kind of situation described, when that's all we're given, this seems like a case where we should help Mike. But in cases where Mike is responsible for the suffering of both of them, we no longer give his suffering equal weight when we're figuring out who to help. Now, notice here that we're only talking about the suffering, right? So if you come onto the scene, especially if you're a medical professional, you don't triage care based on your assumption of a person's guilt. Not when it's a question of who survives and who doesn't. If it's just a question of this person's going to suffer, but they'll be okay, and you've got two people, I think then it is okay, or it seems more okay, to say, look, they're both in a lot of pain. Neither of them are going to die. I'm going to relieve the pain of this person because this other person is responsible for both of them being in pain. So in that case, Kagan suggests, if we really think about what's happening, it isn't that we give the suffering of Mike the same value in the case where he isn't responsible and in the case where he is. The suggestion is not that it has the same weight in both cases, but in one case it's outweighed. The suggestion here is that perhaps in some cases it's outweighed completely. It has no value. So it's not even outweighed. It just has no weight. Or in other cases, it might even have positive weight, a certain factor. If you imagine that someone is responsible for something and they have done something terrible, and you are a retributivist, meaning that you sometimes think that a legitimate function of punishment is to make someone pay, and you think that that's part of rectifying the situation, this is a view that some people hold, then you can imagine some cases where the fact that this individual is suffering more actually gives you reason not to help them first, because you think they're responsible for something and this is their just desserts. So this is the idea here. So we have two different accounts in the Quinn and in the Kagan of what might be misleading about the way that Rachel's operates. Right? On the one hand, we have a claim about what generally happens when we're looking at different factors, that there are claims about overriding rights versus how bad is it if they're violated when they're not overridden. And in the Kagan case, we have not a general rule like that, but rather a kind of almost particularism in the sense that different cases might turn out to be quite different. And so it's hard to come up with principles, or harder than we might have thought, that are going to allow us in the armchair situation to really figure out what's happening. If you've done Aristotle, the virtue ethics approach, I think, is more conducive to the way that Kagan is thinking about things here, because it's going to be hard to come up with some definite principle that is not going to be so abstract as to be useless in situations, right? Because it's hard to say that there is one thing that you can never do. There are going to be some small set of things that you maybe can never do, but it's going to be harder to generalize about things. And so this looks more like the right thing is just something that you have to feel in response to particular situations. And that's the best you can do, because the combinations you meet might be novel. There might be something new going on. We also saw in the beginning of this lecture the two cases that Thompson shows us, the rescue cases. We can look at both of those and apply the kind of approach that Quinn and Kagan both apply to what's going on in the Thompson case, if we want. I think that's enough for today. I will see you all in class on Thursday.